Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about feedback. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, how important would you say that feedback is part of this? How important is feedback as part of the software development process? I would say it's pretty important. It's the way that you figure out whether or not it gives you the holistic understanding of what you're doing and if it's the right way or not the right way. And I think that that's a pretty important thing. I usually say that the most important feedback that you can get as a software developer is at two different levels. You have the team level and you have the product level. So at the team level, the feedback that usually is extremely important to get is on how are you and the other developers aligning on and delivering on the goals of the team. That's extremely important. And in order for you to have these feedback sessions, or not necessarily, it doesn't have to be a feedback session, it's more a question of communication if you ask me. It's a question of, do you all understand what goals that you have, what problems you're trying to solve, and how to design a system as efficiently as possible to reach those goals? Because the problem usually happens is that when you don't have communication between the teams and you don't really get any feedback on your work, or you don't really feel comfortable talking to each other, or talking about different topics or so forth, or sharing ideas or all of this sort of stuff. When you reduce the communication, it almost always ends with the isolation problem, where we talk about teams being silos. I've seen developers can be silos as well, where they sort of work. The most important one is of course front and back, and many times where front end developers never talk to the back end developers. So the back end developers just design random APIs, and the front end developers just sort of make the front end work based on whatever API is there, right? Even if it's shit, or vice versa. And there's tons of these sorts of systematic problems that happen when you don't talk to each other. And so this is why communication is a fairly key point in order for the team to work efficiently with each other. And that ties in, but that also is, I would say, that is a very important problem, but I would even go as far as to say it's less of a problem than not having a product level understanding, or a product level feedback loop of some sort. Because the most common mistake I see usually between teams and team members is that when you work as a software developer, your focus very quickly becomes, in the wrong environment at the very least, to just get the story shipped. Now the problem with that is that if the story is wrong, or you don't have have a good understanding of the greater goals of your team, or the product that you are designing, what's going to happen is that you're going to get the card out, but the system is going to be shit anyway. And the issue with that is that the less efficient you are at understanding what the overall goals are, the more likely you are to model your system incorrectly. Now, what I usually tell people is that the first and foremost thing that you have to do as a software developer is to understand the problem that you are solving. That is everything, because the fundamental thing that you do as a software developer is to take a problem, a domain of some sort, and model it in a virtual, basically a virtual environment, in code, so that you can create a virtual solution, like a system that solves this problem in some way. So if you don't understand that problem, it's very likely that your system will not reflect the realities of whatever you're trying to do. And if it doesn't do that, then fundamentally you have created a system that might be able to do the job, but it's not going to do so very gracefully. And it's very likely that over time, if this continues for long enough, you're going to have to start compromising with feature development. And you have to do that because you have modeled the system poorly. And I usually say that a poor architecture is usually the biggest red flag that you get when you have a poor architecture, is that the cost of everything goes up. Everything takes longer, everything is hard to do, and everything is very error prone. And that is what happens when you have a bad architecture, which is tied into, as I said, having consistent feedback and a strong understanding of what are you actually trying to build, and does this thing actually help with the real life problem that you are solving. Because I see quite a lot of architects and developers and teams and so forth get very quickly into, well, like this was the story specification and so forth and so forth. Yeah, that's great. But the reality is that these are just, you can just say the words. It's like, you know, God help you if you've ever been in a situation where, which is not the case for a lot of software developers in many cases, that your own personal money is up for is basically on the line if you do a bad job. So if you are trying to start your own startup, or you're trying to start your own product or something like that, if your system sucks and your customer won't pay for it, you can say whatever you want, it doesn't really matter. And so that's why having a strong dialogue with your stakeholders at the product level is very important. You have to understand the system that you're building and why you're building it and what it's supposed to be doing and why it's supposed to be doing that. Because when you go and sit at your computer later on and you start writing code, you can structure that code in many ways. And the more you understand how the problems that you are solving work, the domain that you're dealing with, the more likely you are to create good models, good, you know, visual components, or good, you know, good software. Because as I said, all you're actually doing, well, it's a lot, of course, but the fundamental thing you're doing is to try to create all these abstractions and functions and logic and variables and so forth to find a way to solve that issue in an efficient way. And there's a million ways of doing that, and the best usually end code happens when you understand how to structure your abstractions, your classes, your functions, all of that stuff in a way that fits this specific use case. Because when you do that well, that means that when feature number 2 comes along, you can actually efficiently just continue scaling. And this is the greatest challenge that the software developers face: scaling, handling complexity over time. It is the biggest challenge you have, and you are more likely to be able to sustain a good working system if you have consistent feedback sessions with your stakeholders, you present features, you make sure that you understand whether or not this is the direction that you're supposed to be heading. It's the same thing when you work with your coworkers. Having feedback and communication between your coworkers is also key in order for you to know if your software is any good, if you forgot something, or if you should think about something, etc., etc. That works. It's not just at the team level, guys, it's at the product level as well. So what I want you to take away from this is that feedback is absolutely a very critical part of the software development process, and this is why I tell people that if you want to have the best chance at creating a well-working system, you have to have some way of receiving feedback on the product that you are developing. If you have no interest or any product, if you don't have any product focus, if you're just in a team with engineers who will, as I like to say, they're basically code monkeys, they will just do whatever it says on the story card. That's a very dangerous situation to be in, because that means that the code you can never write a story specification that is so perfect that it will substitute a developer who really knows the domain and knows how to model that domain. There are many problems that can be modeled in many different ways, and the best software developers usually understand their domain well enough to create good solutions. This is the main difference between someone who is a true senior and someone who is not a true senior, because the seniors usually have the experience necessary in order to create better solutions that fit long term, that actually have greater sustainability over time or greater efficiency, all of that, this sort of good stuff. And that comes from understanding some greater perspective or having a greater view of things than someone who doesn't have that perspective. And so if you have software developers who never talk to each other, or like they don't grow as software developers, or they don't really think so much about the product and so forth, they will take more shortcuts, they will structure the code and so forth in a worse way and so forth. And usually what happens very quickly is that you start seeing the cost of new features and bugs and so forth. They start to accumulate, and they accumulate because the software developers are simply doing whatever they suspect they might have to do at this very point. But if they don't have a strong understanding of the problem they are solving, they will ultimately model the system incorrectly, and that just it's a snowball effect. You start modeling it in the incorrect way, and then you try to patch that again, patch it because you get new feature requirements, but you still don't really know what you're trying to end at, like your end goal. You don't understand your customers, you don't understand what's going to make them happy, so you just keep on modeling things incorrectly until ultimately, and you can check yourself, how many times do you have to compromise with how the specifics of a feature should work? That's a very good measurement. If you find all the time that you can't really build exactly the thing that your customers want, and you have to either patch it together, hack it, or like make some type of compromise with how it should work because of technical reasons, that's usually a good indicator that your architecture is probably not that great. And this usually happens when people who are software developers or like these product teams model systems without actually understanding the underlying problems that they are solving, because usually there's some user, some consumer somewhere who wants the system to do something, and if you don't understand them, it's very difficult for you to make something that's going to make them happy. So you need to talk to them. Have a great day.